Hi everyone, this is Blake Anderson and I'm a registered social worker and therapist here in Toronto, Ontario. I have over 14 years collective experience as a registered social worker and 5 years working as a therapist. In this video, I want to respond to a video I watched with two experts in the field, Dr. Mark Ettensohn and Peter Salerno. These two are psychologists and specialize in personality disorders, and in this debate that they had, they are offering their perspective in terms of psychology of the narcissist particularly, and giving responses in terms of debating aspects of the origins of narcissism, the definition of narcissism, genetics versus like the environment, and also like trauma and how it might impact or cause narcissism. And so I just want to respond to aspects of their video, particularly the first part of the video, where they start talking about, is it genetic narcissism or is it part of the environment? And as in like the parents or the environment causes the narcissism, which a lot of people talk about the notion of the false self. So the child, in order to protect their more vulnerable part, creates the false self. And so this goes back to Winnicott in terms of object relations. And so he had this notion of the false self. The doctors debate these two concepts. They err on the fact that it's most likely genetic, at least to some components of it. Dr. Mark Ettensohn mentions that he believes the more genetics that the child has, like in terms of the having onset or predisposition in terms of narcissism, that the more likely the environment will cause narcissism. Whereas let's say that they don't have the genetic disposition of narcissism, then they most likely won't get these aspects turned on in terms of their genetics.
I think I would think that for the most part, maybe there's a kind of proportionality to heritable and environmental factors. Uh, the higher the heritable propensity, let's say, the lower the amount of trauma is required. The lower the heritable propensity, the higher the amount of trauma. And it's a pretty like gross reduction, you know? I mean, that's just like that's kind of taking a kind of hacking it up a little bit.
I recently interviewed Dr. Keith Witt, and he said it's up to 80-85% genetic.
Personality disorders are highly heritable. 75 to 85% of narcissism is heritable. We're born to be a narcissist or a borderline or a obsessive compulsive personality disorder.
Dr. Martha Ethan mentions that it's much lower, like 30 to 40%, according to studies.
The data, for the most part, converge around 40 to 50% variance accounted for by heritable factors in personality disorder in general. So, I mean, and it depends on the study and it depends on the heritable factors we're looking at and blah, blah, blah. But, I mean, it would be silly to say that that heritability isn't a factor, because it clearly is. The question is, how much of the picture does it take up?
And so there isn't, though, from my understanding, when I've listened to Sam Vatkin, any kind of brain studies that particularly directly correlate or I guess prove that narcissism is like a part of the brain or an actual gene that we know. That the doctors also talk about that it could be like a trait aspect in terms of evolutionary strategies to have narcissism.
So when I think about traits, I think about from an evolutionary perspective. I think that these traits needed to be extreme in certain historical contexts in order to adapt and survive, right? And I believe traits are passed from our ancient DNA. Traits survive because they serve an important purpose. I think what I would call disorder related to personality, in certain contexts wouldn't be considered disorder. It would be considered a necessity, right? I mean, you need somebody, we'll just say, callous and ruthless enough in certain contexts to protect people. You need somebody willing to merge instantaneously enough for, when we need to procreate. There's legitimate purposes for the like the extremes of these traits. I would say that the people who are exposed to trauma, who already sort of have that inherent trait profile, and again, we would have to define trauma. You're defining it as injury, maybe any sort of not only adverse experience, but I would say just experience in general too. People select and modify their environments. I would say that if somebody has the propensity to be pretty entitled, and then they start experimenting or exploring with that in relationships, maybe they see how far they can push somebody, and then it benefits them. I would say it's almost in their nature to continue to act in that way, and then they're literally cultivating environments where they're practicing being entitled. So I would say that that's really why the trait. I don't want to oversimplify it and say that I believe that these are just strictly trait-based disorders, but I would say that, but you would need that trait profile in order for the trauma or the environmental experience in general, the non-shared environmental experience, let's say, even like outside of the family. I would say that I would be hard pressed to find somebody who didn't have those traits already in them in a certain degree for that to be kind of developing into what we would call personality disorder.
A lot of this is self-reports, right? So a narcissist, the only way that it's determined is through self-reporting and through just observation from the psychologist or psychiatrist. That's why it's difficult, because with a narcissist, even let's say they did have a very traumatic childhood, then it's perhaps the case that they would never admit that they actually had this bad childhood. So it's because then there's also the notion of recall and the suppression of memory and the way we make memory. It could be the case that there is trauma in the person's life, but they either don't acknowledge it or don't have any recall of it. So that's just an interesting question. There's also, in Koff, he has the term of the good enough parent. And so if you don't have a good enough parent, that's seen as a cause of narcissism. The child has to create these defenses, like the false self, in order to protect this vulnerable part of themselves. And so that's often seen by Winnicott and like object relationship school as the cause of narcissism.
And this kind of goes back to like Winnicott and other kind of like classic analysts looking at the early care environment. It is the job of the environment to meet the child where they are, and to the extent that the environment is not able to do that, it is a trauma. Maybe the child's entitled. Maybe the child is colicky and has a really hard time being soothed. Maybe the parents are depressed and financially strapped and working 2 jobs and all the rest. I'm not here to assign blame, but simply to say that when the developing child is not met where they need to be met by the environment, that is an environmental deficit, and that is a form of trauma. And it's internalized by the developing personality to produce areas of overcompensation, areas of deficit, disturbances in identity, maladaptive interpersonal strategies, all the rest.
Dr. Peter Salerno thinks that he shares from his experience, he knows it's not entirely just the environment. He mentions through university or his own schooling, he always thought you could understand it through psychology, like a psychodynamic school. But he opened his mind to a multidisciplinary perspective and saw aspects that suggest that there are genetic components.
Well, I'm curious if you believe that it's possible for the deficits to exist from the get-go, meaning, if there's a deficiency based on a sort of innate propensity, that even the good enough parent, Winnicott's good enough parent, might not stand a chance against somebody who just can't seem to be a good fit for that parenting. And it's not necessarily that there's an injury per se, but there's almost like an inherent rejection of that style. I think Daniel Stern talks about this, like parents being a good fit or not, and it's sort of like a lottery. I'm just curious if you think that there is any predisposed deficiencies and that could be the reason why something couldn't be cultivated even in a good enough environment.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah. So like, in other words, the heritable factor, such as it is, makes, like, insulates the child from, in like a negative way, from what the environment, even the best environment could provide.
Yeah, or good enough. Like maybe there's a perceptual gap from the get-go that makes them unable to perceive even the good environment as loving. I mean, maybe they do perceive it as rejecting or dismissive, but it's not actually.
Yeah, I mean, I could grant that possibility.
Someone who's a psychopathic person, and there is studies that show that there's certain aspects of the brain are activated and less activated in terms of that disorder.
You know, especially if we're looking at psychopathy, let's say, there's pretty robust, brain imaging evidence that psychopathy, has to do with like lower amygdala volume and stuff like that. That just the system itself, it takes more to produce excitement. It takes more, that the stimulus threshold is much higher, which leads to sensation-seeking behavior, which leads to a kind of insulation from, like societal norms, internalizing those, which leads to a kind of a basic adversarial or antagonistic stance toward people, etc., an instrumental use of them toward power and dominance. So, yeah, I mean, I could see how, at least with psychopathy, something like that could be possible. And to the extent that pathological narcissism and psychopathy overlap, which I think they do in some instances, I could see, that also being a factor.
But within narcissism, at least from my understanding, there's no actual direct evidence that it's genetic, no exact brain or genes that can be exactly correlated with narcissism, at least at this point. We don't have those. But it's tricky. I'll have to look more into that because at least 30-40% say it's genetic. So I guess the question is, what evidences are they pointing to that? And then I have someone like Dr. Keith Witt saying it's closer to 70 to 80% that is personality disorders is due to actual genetics. And then we have someone like Sam Vatkin who says there's no brain studies, although I think he says his intuition is that it is likely has a genetic component. But these two doctors also debate how they define narcissism. Dr. Peter Salerno talks about the aspect that it's the extremes of behavior, whereas the other doctor debates extremes is one thing, because obviously if you're a savant or a genius, then that obviously doesn't mean that you're necessarily have narcissism. I guess his point is that it has to have some level of disease or deficit that this disorder is causing. He just mentions that, according to him, the definition is an identity disturbance, organization of objects and subject. So there's a fractured self, so it's not a cohesive self. And
I guess I would say, I would define pathological narcissism as a dysregulated self-esteem system, accompanied by identity disturbance, that involves, at least some of the time, grandiosity, but is also accompanied by what we would call collapse or vulnerable symptomatology, and also the presence of maladaptive coping strategies, be those intrapsychic or interpersonal. So it's a little bit different than what Peter's putting out there. It seems to me that he's describing pathological narcissism as a disorder of extremes, right? That's kind of the dimensional piece of it. I disagree a little bit with his characterization that we could call things that deviate markedly from the norm pathology, because then we'd be calling like geniuses and savants, pathological. I think that it has to be accompanied by some kind of deficit or disability, some kind of distress, some kind of, what we would kind of define as pathology, right? An illness of some kind.
yeah, so that just goes back again to this notion of the false self and the ways in which the narcissist has memory that's faulty. And there's usually, and he also says there's grandiosity and identity disturbance, and there may be some trauma. that's caused. There has to be grandiosity, this object-subject distinction that's confused or fractured. And then there also likely some trauma aspect to it. And the way he defines trauma is through like an injury. And then the other doctor, Peter Salerno, mentions that, I think he says because of his own experience, both in the clinical setting and then I guess in his own personal life, he definitely thinks these individuals, it's fully defensive, because a lot of people will say that narcissism is a defensive strategy to defend against this true self that they have, but they create a false self. And so it's more about defending their image and the superiority that they believe they have. But he says is that it's also can be offensive or on the offense. So in the sense that the narcissist will go after somebody and actually do it premeditated and wanting to do harm to somebody, but there's no empathy.
Well, one of the reasons I believe it is because I think both clinically, professionally, and personally, I've experienced the intentionality of exploitation and types of behaviors that really don't factor in the harm that they're going to cause the other person. It's sort of like a means to an end. Like I have a need, I have a desire, I have a want. I'm going to find a way to make that happen for myself. And there's not an internal brake pedal, like enough empathy or enough conscience online. It's like the conscience is ineffective enough in those moments for the person to really be self-serving enough. I think that that's certainly directly related to what we would consider narcissistic. And so that's one thing. I think just experience lends itself to the possibility that there's, of course, we all have defenses. We all have defense mechanisms. We have ego defenses that develop out of necessity. But I also think that we have offensive strategies that are strategic out of necessity. From our evolutionary history. I think there are times people have needed to be self-serving and ruthless to the extreme to survive. I don't believe that narcissists are completely walking around all the time unconsciously defending themselves as a result of the injuries they suffered. I believe that sometimes they are very clear and conscious about what they are doing, and they do it because it benefits them. So I'm not saying that there aren't defenses at play. I would say that it's not just defenses at play.
And it'd be interesting the way that Sam Vatkin would make that distinction, because again, he believes that narcissism is in a shared fantasy, and they're just doing this as, I think, primarily a defense against their false self. But Dr. Peters Salerno is mentioning that it can be, he believes that they know what they're doing in some sense, and they are proactively harming somebody with a lack of empathy. It's just interesting that there is disagreement and debates within psychology, but there is some common agreements. I think identity disturbance is an actual disorder and a malignant aspect of one's personality. So there are common patterns that these doctors in this debate agree upon. But I guess it's just a question that there's different aspects of whether it's nurture versus nature. Certainly it could be the case that one maybe has a disposition for narcissism, and they even might grow up in a good enough parent home, but still grow up, let's say there's twins or two sisters and a brother, and they are very much likely nurtured the same way, but for whatever reason the brother becomes narcissistic. So then the question is it just the environment? And it seems like a lot of people are erring on the fact that it is genetic to some components. But like anything, if you have the disposition or like this, so I've done 23andMe, right? So you can do these genetic testing, and then you get your SNPs, right? You can get further research of evidence of what these SNPs mean in terms of your genetics. But it is your lifestyle. Let's say you have a predisposition for heart disease in your family. If you're overweight, not working out, not eating healthy, smoking, like aspects that are going to likely turn on these genes more likely, right? So you can also understand that within narcissism, because of the environment, these genetics get turned on more. If there's trauma caused to the child, then more narcissistic genetics will be turned on. Certainly there's a case that there could be a higher disproportionate aspect of these genetics in the individual. In that case, the environment would be less of a cause of the narcissism. Or it could be the case that they have a very low genetic predisposition for narcissism, and the environment is very traumatic and very abusive and neglectful, and then that causes narcissism. That's the intuition of the one doctor in this debate, Dr. Mark Ettensohn. I think I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah, I would agree, except I would say that the parts that are more offensive, I see them as the products of distorted self and object images, and a psychological difficulty in appreciating that other people are themselves subjects in certain states of mind. So the term for this would be mentalizing, basically. Understanding that what's in my mind is not the same thing as what's in the other person's mind. Understanding that if I inflict harm on a person, that harm has lasting consequences and can't be magically erased or undone or obliterated by simply shifting my mental state. And this is not just for people with NPD, but this is an issue across personality disorders. It's not all defensive, but I would say that the parts that are disordered, that we would recognize as disorder, stem from underlying instabilities and distortions in self and object images.
Sometimes, because one of the reasons that this is actually really important, I think, to address. So I'm glad we are. But I would say there have been times when, in clinical practice, I've been working with these individuals, and they, in moments of clarity, they very much admitted how much they felt justified and entitled to retaliate following not a defensive reaction, but sort of like time has lapsed. There's no more threat or perceived threat. Now I have the sense to want to do this thing to this person, as long as I don't get caught. I'm not concerned with being bad so much as being perceived as bad. And so I would say that, can we call that a distortion? Yeah, I mean, certainly. But I also think that I think some of these individuals absolutely wouldn't want to give up if it is in fact a distortion, or even, let's say, a mentalizing deficit, like an inability to mentalize properly. They wouldn't give it up for anything because it works for them. And so they're benefiting from it. It's not just that they're suffering or in distress and then this is a reaction. I would say that there's a lot of primary and secondary gain for being this way, because it gets these people what they want in a lot of ways. And I don't see them all the time as walking around as these dissociated victims of circumstance, so much as they are getting pretty clear and strategic on how they can manipulate people. I've experienced these individuals that we would call personality disordered admitting to preferentially targeting people. Again, this operates on a continuum. Not all of these people are malignant, but if they can get away with it, fine. And that doesn't really rattle them. And this is why I would consider these individuals different than the people that we typically refer to as neurotic, who have these internal conflicts. They have all the same defenses, Mark, that you're talking about. They have all the similar injuries, but there's just something a little bit different about them in their operating system that makes it okay for them to continue in this way despite severe consequences even to themselves. And I've experienced them admitting to it being something that kind of works for them. So there's a conscious and deliberate aspect of it that can become automatic and habitual. But I just don't see everybody operating from defenses. I think that there are some exceptions to that.
This kind of, again, gets down to what we call disorder.
Mhm.
I would say that it is what you're describing, inability to sort of learn from experience, that to my mind is symptomatic of the lack of a reflective capacity, basically. Again, these are ego functions that are either not there, or they're there inconsistently or insufficiently. The ability to bridge reflectively between different self states, that I do conceptualize as the function of trauma and dissociation. But in other words, splitting,
Mhm.
right? The person is grandiose and entitled and engaged in a self-justified retributional fantasy, right? I'm going to get this person back because they didn't pay me a compliment at the Christmas dinner or whatever it is, you know. Okay, but then what I'm saying is there's also typically complementary split off self states that contain other constellations of experience and behavior, thoughts and perceptions, self and object images. So it's a dysregulated system that I would say is the personality disorder. Not necessarily the presence of certain traits, but rather the internal incoherence. And there are different flavors of that incoherence. The one we happen to be talking about is NPD.
In this video, I wanted to talk about, is it genetic? Is it nurture versus nature? I certainly think that I've talked to many people that would be considered or are narcissistic, and I asked them about their childhood. It's interesting because I don't think it's always the case that it's necessarily traumatic childhoods that cause this. I like their discussion about, is it just defenses, or is it proactive in terms of being on the offense? Let's say that narcissists feel slighted and then they go after that person and they know what they're doing. I find this interesting because there hasn't been a full conclusion about this. I think maybe at the end of the day, at least according to with my audience, maybe ultimately doesn't matter per se. I think it's interesting to understand what's the cause of this. These individuals have a disorganization of self, and there is a disturbance of the self. And this kind of goes back to Sam Vatkin about the notion of object relationship school. So the subject and object. So you can understand, according to him, it comes back traditionally or typically to the mother, in terms of the mother being like the first object of the child. And the notion is that the narcissist in their romantic relationships or even family or friends recreate this dynamic as the notion of this dual mothership model. So again, this goes back to the notion of a shared fantasy. So they create this, like they want you basically to be their mother, to reenact this early childhood so that they can individuate and become a person. So that's the notion that they merge with the subject object in the world. A healthy individual sees people as objects, and there's a notion of mentalization. The narcissist will convert these objects into internal objects and create snapshots. Sam Vatkin talks about how these individuals are semi-psychotic. They don't have good reality testing, and they merge with other people. And this is why a lot of my clients, there's like a level of crazy making that will occur when they're around a narcissist for too long, as they will, I think the narcissist very much wants them to merge with them and like emotionally fuse with them, and not allow the individual to have their own opinion, own feelings, their own reality testing. They want the individual to outsource the reality testing to them because they have this identity disturbance and confusion, like a fractured self, and this grandiosity that they believe they're this awesome, great person. They have no qualms of not saying that person shouldn't do that. In this video, I talked about aspects of the debate between these two doctors in terms of understanding the definition of narcissism, but also the debate between nurture and nature. I've seen different numbers in terms of percentages of how much is genetic and how much it's the environment. I would say that it's still an open question. Maybe in further videos, I'll further explore. Have a great day.